الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير الخلق محمد خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته and welcome to In the Shade of Ramadan. The topic inshallah of this episode of In the Shade of Ramadan is the remembrance of Allah, a critical and core important topic to the heart of any believer. When talking about the remembrance of Allah, we need to remember that with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala we have a relationship, and all relationships require remembrance of the other party, require the individual remembering the other party when they're not present. And remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the opposite of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran when He says وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ. This very dangerous thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us of not being those who forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so Allah would cause them to forget their own selves. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to make us of those. The remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very core and central to our belief because of the fact that in every situation we face in life, in our day-to-day existence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the strong, the powerful. We believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Al-Qawi. We believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Al-Latif, the one who is subtly aware and subtly kind to us in the details of our everyday life. And therefore, this issue of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must be on the mind and heart of the believer because of their belief in the station and in the active agency of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of the details of their life. One of the important ahadith that is mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ in connection with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that he who prays Salat al-Fajr in congregation and then sits remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until the sunrise and then prays 2 rak'at has, and the Prophet ﷺ emphasized this many times over, a complete reward of Al-Hajj and Al-Umrah. Imagine the level of forgiveness and the level of purity that one has after they've completed a Hajj, as though they're a newborn child, and that can be had through some remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the morning. So let's discuss a little bit the method of going about remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we take as a cue for this the ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions for us a recipe, where He says,
الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض.
Those who remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala standing and sitting and on their sides and think about the creation of the heavens and the earth. And we can see in this ayah that remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that encompasses every part of our life. It encompasses our standing and our sitting and our lying and our sleeping, and every single thing we do in life is encompassed within that remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we should incorporate the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every single aspect and every single detail of our life. When dhikr of Allah is mentioned in the Quran, He mentions that we should do dhikr a lot. He doesn't mention that we should do just a little bit. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, every time He mentions dhikr, He mentions kathir. He mentions that there should be a lot of it. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that there's a little bit of remembrance of Allah, Allah is mentioning that thing in a bad way. And so what we understand from that is what we're asked to do and what we are commanded to do is not just to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're asked to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala very much and a lot. There was a companion who mentioned Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 100,000 times in a day. This is a great amount of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's the level that we're seeking to attain. The remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every aspect of our life can be accomplished in a variety of ways. One of them is tying the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to some of the regular events and some of the regular happenings of our life. For example, the dua for riding our cars, we can tie that to buckling our seat belts. If whenever we buckle our seat belt, we remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that way, we will increase our remembrance and we won't forget to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Perhaps if we sometimes lay down to sleep after Fajr, that's a very good time to incorporate our morning adhkar and remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that way and tie it to a regular part of our day. Every time we sit down to a new task to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, that's a very important remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we do it with full cognition of what we're actually doing. And some of the common ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself mandates for us in Al-Islam is seeking forgiveness. For example, when we're finished with a prayer, after we exit the bathroom. There are many of these things that tying the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to an event in our life helps us to increase in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second thing that we know from the ayah that was mentioned before is that an important part of remembrance of Allah is contemplating the personal blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the individual. And this is a great experience that uplifts the individual and raises their spirituality and their awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In addition to contemplating that, it's very important to contemplate the attributes and the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is something that we need to focus on. The last piece of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I wanted to mention as a concrete item is to read the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a very personal way, to read the Quran and really reflect on it. And that's a very important way of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we manage to do the things which I've mentioned, and they are a great task, if we manage to do them, we have a lot to expect from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have a lot to look forward to from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first thing that we have to look forward to is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would soften our hearts and allow Iman to enter our hearts if we would increase and be very plentiful in our remembrance in Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising us that with the remembrance of Him, our hearts will be at ease and our hearts will be at rest. This is a very great thing and a thing a very large number of people are seeking in their life, and we have the way to achieve it. And the last thing that I wanted to mention as effects of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ. If nothing else is a great reason to engage in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's that when we remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah the Almighty, the Great, will remember us. And that should fill our hearts with joy and enlighten us and motivate us, insha'Allah, to increase in our remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jazakumullahu khairan, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.